Welcome to Stay Home, Stay Focused. I'm Jack Moline. I'm the president of Interfaith Alliance. Hoping everybody's doing well today. And I have as my extremely special guest today, Senator Mazie Hirono, Democrat from Hawaii. And Senator, I'm going to start with the same question I ask everybody. How are you doing in all of this?
I'm hunkered down like everybody else. But, my husband is in Hawaii and I'm here. And so we talk to each other and we haven't figured out quite how to do this part yet, but we'll get there. So I'm hunkered down. I'm doing okay.
Good. I'm glad to hear it. And you're feeling all right.
Yes.
Good. Good. What do you find to focus on for yourself during this quarantine that we're all suffering through?
One of the things that I do personally, as you know, Jack, that I really love to do creative things. So I have a tiny apartment with a counter. And so I make paper and I dry my paper on the counter and I make cards to send to people. And if you would like to see one of my cards, I have them, I have everything.
We'd love to see some of what you're doing. You were just showing me before we came on cards. Hold them up a little bit. Let people see them.
Okay. So I do a series like cherry blossoms are my favorite flowers because I was born in Japan and we used to do cherry blossom viewing. So this is paper that I made and I paint the stylized cherry blossoms on them. And then I also have what I call my botanical series. I just collect leaves from everywhere and I stick them on my cards. And then I am doing right now what I call my watercolor series. So this is part of what I do. And then yesterday I had fun making bread long distance on FaceTime with my friend who lives in Santa Monica. So I'm making sourdough bread and he even mailed me the starter and the flour.
Very nice. And you showed me you're doing origami also.
Oh, yes. Well, I have an entire origami installation in my office and people have been sending me folded origami and I asked them to sign the origami, they're cranes, and then I sold them and there's an entire display in my office. But one of the things I learned to do was to make origami hearts, which I make out of origami. It's a little more complicated than folding the cranes, but I make a lot of these while I'm watching MSNBC. And then I thought, what can I do with all these? And here's what I do. So here's my stationery and I glue the hearts on and I have been sending notes to my friends. I started with the letter A and I'm just going down my list and I send people notes to see how they're doing.
That's just wonderful. As we've talked about, because we're Interfaith Alliance, a lot of the folks who have come on and had these conversations with me are people who profess a very formal connection to faith community. But you have no particular attachment to a particular faith community.
No.
And
but I am a Buddhist, the only Buddhist serving in the Senate.
Well, that's it still creates a situation in which, with all of this emphasis that we're hearing from people on prayer and on gathering in faith communities like that, I think you may have answered this already, but what gives you the spiritual strength to come through these times?
And that's it. I think all of us have spiritual strength, even people who are atheists. It doesn't matter that we all, the way I look at it is, we're all put on this earth not to just make our little selves happy, that we want to do things that are of help, and that's what keeps me going, that I'm in a position where I think I might be able to help people, and of course I have great staff, and this is what we do. And I tell my staff, and I've been saying this for a really long time, and you also know, Jack, that sometimes I use colorful words, but this is something that I've said to my staff from a long time ago. I've said, look, people in our country are getting screwed every single second, minute, hour of the day. And if by our efforts we can lessen that number, we will be doing our jobs. We will be making a difference. And so that's what I believe. And I've been doing this for a long time, this mean politics, for a long time.
I think a lot of people don't understand that the principles that you just expressed are not so unusual among people who serve in Congress and the Senate and at all levels of government. People get into it to do good, not to do harm. And it troubles me tremendously when we talk about draining the swamp and getting rid of people who have served a long time. You're no less serving this country than the people who suit up in uniform and go out and protect our interests abroad.
Oh, very much so. And of course, I serve on the Armed Services Committee, so I'm very supportive of our troops, and I'm much more focused on what we're doing to make sure that all of our troops are protected. And as you know, they're seeing incidents of coronavirus in their ranks also. So, you know, that's something that's important, but all of us can do something that makes a difference. And one of the things, Jack, about this horrible situation and this challenge is that every day I see on TV people who are doing things that makes a difference, like the teenagers who are helping, and it gives me hope. And I think it keeps all of us going to know that this kind of terrible times bring out the best in people. It also brings out the not so good parts. And, you know, I have to say that, Jack, you know that I do not hold back on criticizing the president and anybody else who I think deserves criticism. And while so many of my colleagues ran for office, one hopes to do good, it really bothers me when they take the kind of votes that they do to get rid of the Affordable Care Act and some of and the 1.5 trillion in tax cuts that went to the richest individuals and corporations. It bothers me a lot that they have no problems voting for those kinds of measures.
So is the Senate functioning, speaking of those measures now? Are y'all able to fulfill your responsibilities while you're all quarantined and separated?
We're all teleworking. I think that when it comes to a functioning Senate, it requires individuals who take that to heart. And I can tell you, Mitch McConnell is not one of those people. And sad to say that even the COVID-3, which is the huge $3 trillion that, thanks to the Democrats, as far as I'm concerned, focuses so much more on workers and small businesses than what Mitch McConnell had in mind when he first brought that forward without any consultation with the Democrats. And we forced, that kind of negotiations to occur. And then we're working on COVID-4, which again, he brought forward on a consent, what we call a consent, and is to provide $250 billion more without any kind of indications as to how the $370 billion that we wanted small businesses to get, whether that's even working properly. So this is what Mitch McConnell does. And, frankly, if he would change his attitude about things and wanted to work together, well, the Senate would be a far better place, and it would be functioning a heck of a lot better than it is now. I have a lot to say about what's going on in the Senate, but it might cause me to swear, so I won't go there maybe.
I'm glad you're saying it for us.
Jack, these are not usual times, and if you're not provoked to swear once in a while, you're not paying attention.
You mentioned the money that is being allocated to small businesses. There is a lot of discussion going on about whether houses of worship and other parochial religious institutions ought to be eligible for those funds. How do you feel about that?
You know what? Basically, nonprofits, I hadn't thought about houses of worship as being first and foremost who would come to mind in terms of the $370 billion that we put together for small businesses, because what I'm focusing on are the restaurants and all these people who have had to close up, and the millions of people who are out of work and who are literally having to go to the food bank. So those are the people that should be getting the money, and I don't think they are, certainly not to the extent that we would like them. And so, I'm a big believer in separation of church and state. And we see a lot of smooshing together of those things in other areas. And so rightly or wrongly, it's a good question, especially for the community that you represent. I don't necessarily have any problems with houses of worship, especially those, as far as I'm concerned, who do the work that I think houses of worship should do, which is to be like, to be in the community and helping people. I would not have problems with enabling them to continue that work by having access to the support that we gave. But as I said, first and foremost, I know in talking to small businesses in Hawaii, I don't think of the 1 point whatever billion that's already, 100 billion that's already gone out the door for small businesses. I haven't heard from a single business and small business in Hawaii who got any of that money yet.
Very interesting. That's very interesting.
Yes.
I want to come back to Hawaii in a second, but our organizational position is very much the same as yours. The houses of worship themselves should not be supported by these dollars guaranteed by the government, but the social safety nets that they provide in accordance with
Yes.
government regulations should, of course, be funded as they have been
I
regularly.
agree.
On the other side of that issue, though, is the question of whether houses of worship have a right to call together congregants for worship and other communal activities because of their privileges under the First Amendment. Do you think that that should be restricted and that the government should enforce it?
I don't think that houses of worship should be given any special exemption, because when they gather, they are exposing themselves and others to this virus, which knows no denomination. And so health and safety of everyone should come first. And, we also have a First Amendment right to gather.
Right.
And that's not exactly enforced. So freedom of religion, I'm for it, but not when you're putting other people's lives at risk.
We have all sorts of examples of that when it comes to freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and petitioning for redress of grievances. I think this is the first time we've really faced in the United States the importance of applying the other rights and responsibilities in the First Amendment to the religion clause, and we're going to see how that shakes out. I know the Department of Justice is considering some guidance for that as well. You mentioned Hawaii. What we haven't heard much about what's going on in Hawaii, Mazie. Is COVID-19 as much of an issue for the citizens of Hawaii as it is for New York, Georgia, Illinois?
We don't have as many cases, and we want to keep it that way. So the governor has, closed. He has called on businesses to be closed. And yes, it's the same kind of things that a lot of other responsible governors and leaders are doing, that we should stay home and we should not expose ourselves and others. And we also have a 14-day quarantine, and that's one of the reasons that I did not go home, because if I went home, I would be quarantined for 2 weeks, and that seemed to defeat the purpose. So I stay in contact with my constituents from Washington, D.C.
And this is about the contact you would have with them anyway. Everybody is kind of nervous about getting together, even if they think
Yes.
they know the people. My kids who live here in DC came to visit me yesterday, and I cut up some strawberries for them, and they wouldn't eat them because they said, not that we want to reject your hospitality, but we shouldn't be touching things that each other has been touching. So that's what's going on.
I think that's paying attention. And one of the things that I share with probably a number of the people who are watching, listening to this, is we have senior parents. And my mother is in a care facility, although she lived with me and my husband until she was 92. And we finally couldn't care for her in the way she should. So she's in a care facility, and we have not been able to see her at all. So I send her pictures. She's in Hawaii. And she's had 2 strokes, and this is a very sad thing. And so the facility sends me pictures of my mom. I don't think she knows why we can't visit her, but this is a heartache that a lot of families are experiencing.
Relationships, I know, are very important to you, and that's a good illustration. And you've told me a number of times about your relationships with people, both on your side of the aisle and across the aisle in the Senate. Can you talk a little bit about what the advantage and disadvantage is of developing personal relationships with people you legislate with?
All of the bills that I introduced that are not what I call just messaging bills, I make every effort to find Republican co-sponsors, and this is why I have co-sponsored and got signed into law bills that people that you wouldn't think that Joni Ernst and I worked on a bill that got signed into law. There are a number of other people like that. And one of the most fun relationships is my friendship with Don Young of Alaska. And he is a senior member now of the House, but he and I are good friends over a Native American, Native Hawaiian education support bill that he and I saved. This was when we were in the House, and we became good friends. And when I first ran for the Senate, actually, Don Young did an ad for me. It got Mitch a little upset, I learned, but I didn't ask Don to do that. He said, "You're the person that Hawaii needs, and I'm going to do this spot for you." And if you look up Mazie Hirono Don Young, you probably still see the spot on YouTube or something. It's really it's Don, and you couldn't script Don. You know, you have to. He'll say, "I'm going to say what I need to say," and that's it. But that's kind of an unlikely friendship. And so I find bills and issues that other people can support, and it's not the big bills, because things like, you know, don't vote for the 1.5 trillion in tax cuts for the richest,
Mhm.
that we're not going to come to agreement, or on choice, because there's an all-out attack on women's health as far as I'm concerned, and women's right to choose and to have an abortion is a constitutional right under attack at every turn. So we're not going to come to agreement on those issues, but on other things where I think that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would have a similar concerns for their own constituency, we're able to work together, and I'll do that. But I don't seek to change their mind on some of those really big issues that are ideologically based. That they have their position, I have mine, and I articulate my position as strongly as I can.
You know, famously during the Clinton administration, Newt Gingrich cautioned the members of the House against having social relationships with people on the other side of the aisle because he was afraid that it would deflect from their ideological commitment to his agenda. Uh, is there ever a time when it's appropriate to withhold an attempt to create a personal relationship with a fellow legislator?
Oh, I don't think so. If it moves you to do that, a prime example for me is my good friend Chris Coons, who is always reaching across the
Yeah.
aisle. And I say to him, you know, Chris, I very much admire you for doing that. And sadly, he told me that he gets disappointed a lot because they don't live up to the kinds of things they profess to abide by. But he still does it. So if it moves one to do that, but frankly, as I say, I am a pretty self-contained person, as you know, Jack, and it's not like I hang out with a lot of my colleagues, even the ones that I like on the Democratic side. So I say, what the heck? When there's something that I want to talk with my colleagues about, I talk with them. And of course, for the women, in a bipartisan way, we get together and have meals every 2 months or so, and it's a nice time for us to come together in a bipartisan way.
That's wonderful. Before we get to the end of our conversation here, I want to share with the people who are watching a wonderful picture. Um, why don't you tell us about this a little bit?
This is a little cherry tree that was planted right outside my door. I live on the second floor, so I took this picture from my little stoop area. And it was planted a couple of years ago, and I thought it had died. It was really scraggly. You can tell, right? There are no leaves or nothing. But it bloomed, and I was so taken with it. It cheered me up. So I took a picture of it, and I shared it because I think it's really it's a hopeful sign
Right.
in these times. And the cherry blossoms, as I mentioned, are my favorite flowers from the time that I spent in Japan as a child. And I was so happy when they planted this tree a couple of years ago, and I thought it had died, but it has resurrected itself, and it's
Well,
nice. Easter.
I know you sent it off to a number of your friends in the Senate, and that they were just tickled by it and inspired by its message of hope also. So the
Yes.
last question that I ask my guests, Senator, is what can you offer to the people who are watching and listening at home as something that can inspire and engage them, that is different from just trying to keep themselves and their loved ones safe?
I think that this is a time when we really start thinking about who we're close to, and the fact that we can't physically see them. I think it really brings to mind the importance of our relationships, our friends, our families. And this is one of the reasons that I am sending notes to them, starting with the letter A on my iPad. And so I think, it's a time for us to reflect on what's really important and to be kind to others and ourselves. And that's what keeps me going when people, say thank you. And we should thank all of us. And especially, by the way, every day we see the first responders and the fact that they're putting themselves in harm's way without the kind of equipment that we should have for them. And I'm very thankful. And you know what? This is also a time when the essential workers are among the least well paid in our society. So this would be the people working in our supermarkets, the truck drivers, the mail people who, by the way, we need to fund them, otherwise mail is going to stop coming. And all these people that we should never take for granted. And I hope that after we come through this in some fashion, that we will not forget these people who kept us going.
Senator Mazie Hirono, my dear and outspoken friend, it was such a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you very much. And aloha to
Aloha
everyone
to
who's
you and
tuning in.
To everyone watching and listening at home. Stay home and stay focused.
Stay safe.